In a time when the mind is constantly under siege by devices, demands, deadlines, and desires, the individual must return to one simple question: where is your attention? Because attention is the seed of all growth. Whatever you give it to grows. We speak often of purpose, of progress, of power, but we forget that none of these can exist without discipline. Not discipline as punishment, but as structure, as a choice, repeated again and again, even when nobody is watching. Especially when nobody is watching. Discipline is not about doing more. It is about doing what matters, and doing it with full awareness. It is about refusing the pull of the superficial and returning again and again to the essential. Distraction, on the other hand, is subtle. It is not always loud. It does not always arrive in the form of noise. Sometimes distraction wears the face of productivity. A task done without purpose is still a distraction. A goal that does not align with your path is still a detour. The danger of distraction is not just in wasting time. It is in fragmenting your mind. The undisciplined mind is scattered. It tries to be everywhere and ends up being nowhere. It touches everything but holds nothing. It reacts, it overthinks, it jumps, it scrolls, it compares, it doubts, and then it wonders why it feels tired, anxious, or empty. But the disciplined mind is still. It is like a mountain, unmoved by the wind. It is not because nothing calls for its attention, but because it has learned to answer only to what truly matters. Now look around you. The systems of this world are not built to make you disciplined. They are designed to keep you distracted. Every swipe is an invitation to forget your intention. Every alert is a request to abandon your focus. Every comparison is a whisper telling you that you are not enough unless you keep chasing. And yet, the more you chase, the more distant you become from yourself. This is why discipline is no longer just a strength. It is a necessity. It is the armor you wear against the battlefield of distraction. Without it, you are vulnerable to everything, every emotion, every opinion, every external expectation. Discipline is not just about what you do. It is about what you refuse to do. It is about the no's you are willing to say, not out of fear, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. Clarity of what you want. Clarity of who you are becoming. Clarity of where you are going. It is easy to start the day with good intentions. But how quickly they dissolve when the phone rings, when the inbox fills, when someone else's urgency becomes your responsibility. Discipline is what anchors you. It says, I do not move unless it serves the path. I do not respond to everything. I do not need to be everywhere. I do not need to know everything that's happening in the world to know what needs to happen within me. This is not withdrawal. It is wisdom. The monk does not go to the mountains because he cannot face the world. He goes to the mountains to face himself, without the world clouding his vision. And when he returns with presence. He returns with power. He returns with purpose. So too must you train the mind. And training begins in the small things. Discipline is not built in one grand act of will. It is built in micro decisions. The moment you choose to read instead of scroll, to breathe instead of react, to pause instead of speak, to sit in silence instead of chasing noise. Each of these decisions is like a drop of water falling on stone. At first, it seems like nothing. But over time, the water carves the stone. Over time, the practice becomes the person. You are what you repeatedly do. So ask yourself, what are you repeating? If you do not choose discipline, distraction will choose you. And distraction does not come alone. It brings with it its companions: regret, fatigue, anxiety, confusion. It leaves you full but unfulfilled, busy but unproductive, connected but disconnected from yourself. Understand, this deeply discipline is not suppression, it is liberation. When you have discipline, you are no longer a slave to impulse. You no longer react to every itch of emotion. You do not chase every shadow of thought. You are free not because you do what you want, but because you are no longer ruled by what you want in the moment. To master anything, you must first master your attention. And to master your attention, you must discipline your habits. Because where your habits go, your energy follows. And where your energy goes, your life unfolds. The path of growth will always demand focus. Not just intensity, but consistency. Distraction will tempt you with shortcuts. Discipline reminds you that shortcuts are only traps in disguise. That what is easy now becomes heavy later. But what is heavy now becomes light later. The world will not slow down. It will not become quieter. It will not ask you what you need. It will only offer you what sells, what seduces, what screams for attention. You must become the one who chooses again and again not to listen, not to engage, not to be pulled away from yourself. Not because you do not care, but because you care too much about what matters to let it be diluted by what doesn't. Discipline is not about controlling the outside world. It is about commanding your inner world. And when the inner world is steady, the outer world loses its power to shake you. In a world that constantly rewards noise, speed, and visibility, the act of being silent appears outdated. People are conditioned to believe that value is only created when they are loud, active, and visibly in motion. They equate silence with weakness, stillness with passivity. But this is a misunderstanding rooted in restlessness. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is not a void. Silence is space. It is the environment where truth appears without force. To understand the value of silence, one must first observe how easily the mind becomes agitated. Every time there is discomfort, physical, emotional, or mental, the impulse is to speak, to respond, to fill the space. We interrupt others not because we are unkind, but because we are uncomfortable with space. We distract ourselves not because we are unfocused, but because we fear the truth that might arise when everything becomes quiet. Silence threatens the illusion. It makes the unseen visible. That is why so few can sit with it. But silence is not just absence, it is strategy. It is the ability to pause, to listen, to hold back, to wait, and to observe without reacting. And this observation is not passive, it is powerful. Through silence, you gather information others miss. You notice the shift in tone, the tension in words, the contradiction between what is said and what is meant. When you are silent, others reveal themselves. When you speak, you reveal yourself. Most people speak not to communicate, but to be seen. They speak to defend, to justify, to explain, to perform. But strategy is not about being seen. It is about being clear. Silence gives you the space to become clear. Clear about your intentions, clear about your emotions, clear about your direction. Without this clarity, action becomes reaction. Movement becomes chaos. Effort becomes noise. The warrior does not draw his sword with every threat. The monk does not speak to prove his wisdom. The strategist does not reveal the plan before the battle begins. In all these cases, silence is not weakness. It is strength, it is control, it is restraint with purpose. It is discipline turned inward. There is a kind of silence that is louder than any voice. When you walk into a room and say nothing, but your presence commands attention, not because you demand it, but because you are not trying to. That is the result of inner silence. It radiates from within. It is not the silence of fear or suppression. It is the silence of someone who has nothing to prove and everything to protect. Energy, clarity, peace. Silence as a strategy is not about saying nothing forever. It is about knowing when to say nothing. It is the timing that matters. When to speak, when to observe, when to walk away, when to hold back. These decisions are not made with the mouth. They are made with awareness. Silence is the ground where awareness grows. Without it, you speak before thinking. You react before understanding. You commit before knowing. Silence helps you master the space between stimulus and response. That space is your power. It is where freedom lives. The more you develop silence, the more space you create. And in that space, you are no longer a puppet to emotion or impulse. You become deliberate, precise, focused. The practice of silence also teaches endurance. Most people cannot endure the silence of being misunderstood, so they speak quickly to correct the narrative. But this is a trap. The need to be understood immediately is an enemy of long-term mastery. There is power in being misunderstood and choosing not to explain. Not because you are weak, but because your actions are your explanation. Your life is your answer. Silence in conflict is often the highest form of control. Arguments feed on reaction. If one side stays silent, not in avoidance, but in clarity, the flame has no fuel. To be silent in a moment of provocation is not suppression. It is strength. Not every battle is worth fighting. Not every attack is worth answering. Silence gives you time to choose your battles wisely. There are also times when silence is needed to process pain. The world teaches you to move on, to stay productive, to act strong. But silence lets you feel. And without feeling, there is no true healing. In silence, you don't distract yourself from the wound, you face it. You learn where it came from. You understand what it taught you. You honor it before you release it. In relationships, silence is just as strategic. Sometimes the most powerful response to manipulation, drama, or chaos is silence, not as a way to ignore, but as a refusal to engage with energy that disrupts your peace. Not everyone deserves a reaction. Not every situation requires your input. Learning when to be silent is learning to conserve your inner fire. It is the difference between burning bright and burning out. Strategic silence is also a teacher of humility. It reminds you that your words are not always needed, that your opinion is not always necessary, that the world will not collapse if you wait before responding. In silence, you remember how to listen, not just to others, but to yourself, to your intuition, to the signals your body gives, to the wisdom that does not shout but whispers. If you are always speaking, you will never hear it. The most intelligent people are not always the ones who speak the most. They are often the ones who speak last, if at all, because they are gathering, observing, watching the patterns, sensing what is not being said, reading the energy beneath the surface. This is how silence becomes a tool for intelligence, not just emotional, but strategic. In your daily life, silence can become a form of meditation, a reset, a boundary, a sanctuary. You don't need to respond to every message instantly. You don't need to answer every question. You don't need to be present in every conversation. Silence teaches you to filter, to return to yourself, to value your inner world more than the noise outside. And in doing so, you become unshakable, not because you control everything around you, but because you have learned to command everything within you through stillness and awareness formed in silence. In a world that constantly urges you to be visible, connected, and engaged, the idea of stepping back is misunderstood. To withdraw is often labeled as avoidance, as weakness, as failure to keep up. But this judgment comes from those who do not understand the value of stillness nor the necessity of solitude. Withdrawal is not escape. Withdrawal is a return to the source, to the root, to the core of who you are when everything external is stripped away. To strengthen anything, whether it is a muscle, a mind, or a spirit, it must first be allowed space to recover, to recalibrate, to reconnect. A bow that is constantly drawn will eventually lose its tension. A sword that is always used will dull its edge. The same is true for you. You cannot give constantly and expect to remain full. You cannot perform endlessly and expect to remain sharp. You must know when to step back, not as a retreat, but as a recalibration of power. Those who walk the path of discipline understand this. The Shaolin monk trains not only in combat, but in contemplation. Not only in movement, but in stillness. The strength of his body is matched only by the silence of his mind. This balance is not accidental. It is trained through conscious withdrawal from noise, from distraction, from unnecessary engagement with the world. To withdraw does not mean you are lost. It means you are locating yourself again. The world has a way of making you forget. It pulls your attention in 100 directions until you begin to scatter, until your thoughts belong to others, your goals reflect someone else's ambitions, your values become borrowed. In this fragmentation, you lose your center. And when you lose your center, you lose your power. Withdrawal is the act of gathering your attention, gathering your energy, gathering your sense of direction. Only when the pieces return to the center can true strength arise. Withdraw from the opinions of others. Too often, your actions are distorted by the imagined voices in your head, what they'll think, what they'll say, how they'll react. But if you live to be understood by others, you become a stranger to yourself. Withdraw so you can hear your own voice again, unfiltered by validation or fear. Your path is not up for public discussion. It is not meant to be approved before it is walked. And it is only in silence, in solitude, that you will find the courage to walk it fully. Withdraw from comparison. In a world obsessed with speed and visibility, it's easy to believe you're behind, that others are further, smarter, more successful. But comparison is not truth. It is distortion. Every soul moves on its own timeline. Every seed blooms in its own season. Withdrawal allows you to remember that you are not late. You are not ahead. You are simply becoming. And that becoming needs space to unfold. There is a time for engagement and there is a time for refinement. A time for building in the open and a time for rebuilding in silence. Many people attempt to strengthen themselves while still remaining fully immersed in distraction. They seek clarity while staying constantly stimulated. They seek healing while staying constantly surrounded by noise. But you cannot deepen your roots in shallow soil. You cannot hear truth in a crowded room. Strength requires depth, and depth requires silence. Space. Withdraw from conversations that go in circles. from people who drain your energy, from battles that do not serve your spirit. Not every conflict deserves your involvement. Not every discussion requires your presence. Withdrawal teaches you to conserve, to protect your flame. You do not always need to explain. You do not always need to correct. Some things are better left unanswered. Some energies are better left unmet. In solitude, the body remembers its rhythm. The breath slows. The nervous system calms. You begin to feel again without performance. You begin to think again without pressure. You begin to return to yourself, not the self that was constructed for survival, but the self that existed before the world told you who to be. This is not regression. It is reclamation. Think of the archer. Before he releases the arrow, he pulls back. The withdrawal is not hesitation. It is the preparation for precision. The deeper the draw, the further the reach. The same principle applies to your own evolution. When life calls you to pull back, it is not always a sign of collapse. It may be the signal that something within you is preparing to launch, more focused, more aligned, more powerful than before. Even nature withdraws. The tree sheds its leaves in winter not because it is dying, but because it is conserving, preparing, gathering strength in the unseen roots, so that in the next season, it may rise again, fuller, stronger, more complete. You too must learn the wisdom of cycles, the strength of stillness, the power of pausing. Constant output leads to burnout. Constant visibility leads to exhaustion. The soul requires shadows. The spirit requires rest. The warrior, even in discipline, requires recovery. But withdrawal is not always comfortable. It is quiet. And in the quiet, everything you've been avoiding begins to rise. The doubts, the unresolved emotions, the unhealed wounds. This is why most people avoid silence, because they fear what they will hear. But facing what arises is part of the strengthening. You cannot transform what you do not acknowledge. You cannot purify what you do not confront. Withdrawal creates the space for truth to emerge, and with it, the possibility of inner transformation. To withdraw is to commit, not to escape the world, but to rise above its chaos. It is a conscious movement inward. A movement that says, before I engage, I must anchor. Before I act, I must align. Before I speak, I must understand. Before I move outward, I must return inward. The path of self-mastery does not begin with external accomplishments. It does not begin with strength of body, status in society, or the control of others. It begins with one simple yet profound practice, the ability to observe oneself. Not in judgment, not in analysis, but in pure awareness. To observe yourself is to become conscious of your internal world as it moves, shifts, and reacts. It is to become the witness of your emotions without being consumed by them. It is to listen to the voice in your mind without blindly obeying it. Most people live their entire lives reacting, not living, thinking, not knowing, projecting, not seeing. They mistake movement for progress, emotion for truth, thought for fact. But beneath these layers lies a quieter space, a stillness, a vantage point from which everything can be seen clearly. That space is accessed through self-observation. When you begin to observe yourself, you discover how quickly the mind runs ahead of the moment. It anticipates, it assumes, it judges. You notice how anger rises not just from an event, but from interpretation. How fear is not always based in danger, but in memory. How desire is often not for the thing itself, but for the feeling it promises. Through observation, these unconscious processes become visible. And what is visible can be understood. What is understood can be redirected. This is where mastery begins. Not through control, but through clarity. Self-observation is the root of all inner discipline. Without it, discipline becomes forced, rigid, and temporary. But when you observe your tendencies, the way your mind pulls toward distraction, how your body craves comfort, how your emotions influence your choices, you begin to understand your own patterns. And in that understanding, a gap forms. A small, silent gap between stimulus and response, between feeling and reaction, between thought and decision. That gap is freedom. Freedom does not mean doing whatever you feel. It means being uncontrolled by what you feel. It means having a space within you that is not governed by habit, emotion, or impulse. That space is cultivated every time you observe instead of react. Every time you pause instead of explode. Every time you witness your anger rise, your fear tighten, your pride swell, and you choose not to be ruled by it. But this practice is not easy, because self-observation requires humility. It requires you to see things within yourself that you would rather ignore. It reveals your impatience, your envy, your insecurity. It exposes the gap between who you believe you are and who you are in action. But this discomfort is not punishment, it is opportunity. You cannot change what you deny. You cannot master what you refuse to meet. The moment you see it, you gain the power to transform it. Self-observation is not about self-judgment. It is not about labeling your thoughts as good or bad, your emotions as right or wrong. It is about seeing without commentary, letting your internal world unfold like a river, moving, flowing, shifting, while you stand on the bank, watching, just watching. Noticing how your breath changes with stress, how your posture collapses with self-doubt, how your voice speeds up when you're trying to impress. These small signals are not meaningless. They are the language of your inner life. And when you learn to read them, you begin to live consciously. The Shaolin path does not begin with the mastery of the body. It begins with the training of attention. The monk does not swing the sword before learning to still the mind. Precision requires awareness. Power without awareness is dangerous, but awareness without judgment, that is discipline in its purest form, to see clearly, to respond wisely, to remain grounded in the storm of your own inner experience. Even in moments of silence, your mind speaks. It plays out conversations that never happened. It replays memories that cannot be changed. It imagines futures filled with fear or hope. Without observation, these inner narratives become your reality. You act on them, you live through them. But when you observe the mind from a distance, its power begins to dissolve. You begin to understand that you are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. You are the space in which they arise. Self-observation also teaches patience. Growth is not instant. Habits do not disappear overnight. Emotions do not obey logic. Through observation, you learn to sit with discomfort without needing to fix it immediately. You learn to allow the storm to pass without running from it. You learn to trust that presence, not force, is the source of transformation. When you stop trying to control everything inside you and start witnessing it, you create the conditions for natural evolution. The practice extends into daily life. You begin to observe yourself in conversation. When do you speak from ego? When do you shrink yourself to be liked? When do you pretend to agree just to avoid discomfort? You begin to observe your body. When do you eat from hunger and when from anxiety? When do you move with energy and when from obligation? These observations are subtle, but they are the foundation of true self-understanding. And with understanding comes choice. Without observation, you are a product of programming, a bundle of habits inherited from childhood, culture, and conditioning. But with observation, you become the author. You do not have to be who you were yesterday. You do not have to repeat what you've always done. The moment you observe your automatic behavior, you create the potential for a new one, a wiser one, a more conscious one. Self-mastery is not the suppression of emotion or the denial of desire. It is the ability to feel deeply without being possessed, to want without being blinded, to move without being pushed, to think without being consumed. And this ability begins the moment you stop being your thoughts and start watching them. Every day, from the moment you wake up, your energy begins to drain. Not all at once, not in large amounts, but gradually, through choices, through conversations, through distractions, through emotions that go unnoticed and unmanaged. Energy does not vanish in a dramatic collapse. It seeps away silently like water leaking from a vessel with invisible cracks. You may not see it, but you feel it. That sense of being mentally foggy even though you've done very little. That heaviness in the body despite no physical exertion. That emotional exhaustion after social interactions that seemed light. These are all signs not of physical weakness but of spiritual leakage. And to live unconsciously is to leak energy every hour of the day. People speak often of managing time. They track their schedules, optimize their routines, and try to fit more into their days. But time is meaningless without energy. A full calendar means nothing if your mind is tired and your spirit is scattered. It is not how many hours you have. It is how much presence you can bring into those hours. And presence requires energy. Focus requires energy. Clarity requires energy. Without it, everything you touch becomes dull, slow, heavy. The body is not a machine. The mind is not a limitless engine. There is a limit to what you can give before you begin to fall into depletion. Energy, unlike time, is not equally distributed. Some things drain you more quickly than others. Some people leave you more exhausted than full. And yet, most people live as if their energy is a resource that can be endlessly withdrawn from without ever needing to replenish it. To protect your energy, you must first understand where it goes. Begin by noticing. Noticing which tasks leave you energized and which ones leave you numb. Noticing who brings peace into your space and who enters only to take. Noticing how even thinking about certain situations begins to pull your spirit down before anything has even happened. This awareness is the beginning of protection, because you cannot guard what you do not first recognize as valuable. Energy is not only used in action, it is used in attention. What you give attention to, you give energy to. Even if you are sitting still, worrying about a problem that does not belong to you, your energy is already leaving you. Even if you do not reply to the message, the act of reading it, analyzing it, interpreting its tone, this costs you. Not in money, not in time, but in life force. So protect it, not out of selfishness, but out of wisdom. Because everything you do, everything you build, everything you care for, requires you to be full. You cannot give deeply from an empty well. You cannot create from depletion. You cannot lead love or learn with a nervous system that is constantly overwhelmed. Protecting your energy is not an act of resistance. It is an act of preparation. A warrior sharpens his blade not because he is afraid of the battle, but because he respects the need to be ready when the moment comes. This readiness, this internal resilience, cannot be developed while you are always accessible, always involved, always responding. Constant exposure dulls the senses. Constant stimulation weakens clarity. To move through life with awareness, you must learn to withdraw from things that do not nourish your purpose. Not everything deserves your presence. Not every voice deserves your response. Not every opportunity deserves your attention. Protect your energy by setting boundaries, not just with people, but with thoughts. A boundary is not a wall to keep things out. It is a container that protects what is sacred, and your energy is sacred. Boundaries do not need to be loud. They can exist in silence, in not replying, in walking away, in not explaining, in choosing peace over participation. There are interactions that feel small, but are energetically expensive. Gossip, complaining, arguments over nothing, performative conversations. These may seem insignificant, but they carry an energetic cost. Each time you engage with them, you spend something, and the more you spend on what drains you, the less you have for what builds you. Life is constantly offering you a choice: spend your energy or invest it. The difference is awareness. The same is true with internal dialogue. Not all energy loss comes from outside. Much of it is self-inflicted. Through overthinking, through doubt, through the endless internal war between what is and what you believe should be. Every time you criticize yourself, replay the past, or fight against reality, you burn energy. Not for transformation, but for resistance. And resistance is one of the most expensive ways to live. To conserve energy is not to become passive. It is to become precise. To act only when action is required. To speak only when speech adds clarity. To move only when movement is aligned. This is not laziness, it is mastery. Because the master does not waste energy proving himself. He does not chase every idea. He does not entertain every emotion. He chooses. And in choosing wisely, he remains strong, steady, whole. Even rest is a form of protection. Not the rest that comes from collapse, but the rest that is chosen deliberately. Rest is not weakness. It is repair. Stillness is not stagnation. It is cultivation. Just as the soil must lie undisturbed for the roots to grow, your mind must be given silence for your strength to deepen. But this silence must be protected, because the world will constantly ask for more. More effort, more engagement, more presence. It is up to you to know when to say no. Not because you have nothing to give, but because what you have is too valuable to waste. Not everything you lose is a loss. When you walk away from people, habits, or situations that steal your energy, you are not losing, you are regaining, you are reclaiming your time, your focus, your power. The true cost of anything is the amount of life it consumes. Not just in hours, but in vitality, in spirit, in peace. So choose with care, observe with attention, act with intention, and remember that everything you allow into your field is either feeding your fire or dimming your flame. In the stillness of the mind lies the ability to perceive without attachment. In that space between what happens and how you respond to it, there is a doorway to mastery. Most people live on the edge of that doorway but never step through. They react. They are triggered by words, by glances, by tone, by inconvenience. Their emotional world is not governed from within. It is constantly shaped by external forces. And because of that, their peace is always at risk. Their clarity is always dependent on what is happening around them. But the path of inner strength begins with a different kind of awareness, a deeper noticing, a conscious separation between who you are and what you feel in the moment. This is what it means to become the observer. Not to deny emotion, not to suppress thought, but to rise above identification with it. To witness your own inner world with the same clarity that you would observe the clouds moving across the sky, knowing they pass, knowing they shift, knowing they are not you. Reactivity is natural to the untrained mind. It is instinctual. Someone insults you, you defend. Someone disagrees with you, you argue. Someone cuts in front of you, you feel anger rising. But these reactions are patterns, not truths. They are rehearsed responses built over time, reinforced by repetition, and fueled by unconscious identification. The reactive mind lives in a state of perpetual alertness. It is always on edge, always defending, always controlling. And in that constant motion, there is no space to see. To become the observer is to create that space, that distance, that inner stillness where you no longer get pulled into every wave that arises. The wave comes, fear, anger, anxiety, but instead of becoming the wave, you watch it. You feel its energy, you acknowledge its presence, but you do not let it take the lead. You do not build stories around it. You do not let it dictate your speech or your next decision. You stay still, present, anchored. This does not come from suppression. Suppression is pushing emotion away. Observation is allowing it fully without losing yourself in it. There is a difference. When you suppress, the emotion returns stronger. When you observe, it dissolves over time. Not because you pushed it down, but because you outgrew the need to follow its command. The observer is not distant or cold. The observer is intimate with the self, closer than thought, closer than feeling. The observer sees the first flicker of jealousy before it turns to resentment. The observer notices the contraction in the body before the voice raises in defense. The observer watches the ego as it tries to prove, to defend, to dominate, and simply chooses not to feed it. This is not weakness. This is power. Because real power is not about controlling the world. It is about controlling your response to it. The reactive mind sees everything as personal. Every criticism is an attack. Every delay is disrespect. Every obstacle is injustice. And in this lens, life becomes a battlefield. But the observer sees through a different lens. The observer knows that people speak from their own wounds, that moods change like weather, that most situations are not about you. They simply are. The observer does not internalize every event. The observer reflects, studies, learns, and then responds if response is needed at all. Training the mind to observe requires patience. It is not built in a moment. It is built in the small spaces of daily life. When someone interrupts you and you notice the irritation rising, that is your moment to observe. When you feel dismissed and the urge to explain yourself grows strong, that is your moment to pause. Each time you witness the reaction rise but choose not to follow it, you strengthen the observer. You deepen your center. You expand your inner space. Silence helps. Stillness helps. Solitude is a powerful teacher because in silence, the noise of the reactive mind becomes more visible. You begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly. The inner narratives, the assumptions, the mental habits. And through that clarity, the work begins not to control your thoughts, but to see them as temporary. Not facts, not commands, but movements of the mind. And when you see this clearly, you are no longer bound by them. This also transforms relationships. The reactive person argues to win. The observer listens to understand. The reactive person speaks from pain. The observer speaks from presence. You do not need to win every conversation. You do not need to fix every misunderstanding. Sometimes silence speaks louder than defense. Sometimes walking away is wiser than proving your point. When you are rooted in awareness, peace becomes more important than being right. The world will not stop presenting you with things to react to. That is the nature of life. Delays will happen. People will disappoint you. Emotions will rise, but you do not need to meet the world with the same energy it gives you. You do not need to mirror chaos with chaos, anger with anger, fear with fear. You can choose to be the one who slows down, who breathes, who watches, who responds not from impulse but from alignment. And in doing so, you begin to reclaim your power. Because the person who can sit with discomfort without reacting is the person who cannot be easily manipulated. The person who can hear criticism without crumbling is the person who cannot be controlled by opinion. The person who observes rather than reacts becomes unshakable, not because the world is easy, but because their foundation is steady. Reaction is fast, loud, emotional. Observation is slow, quiet, discerning. One burns energy, the other builds it. One scatters, the other centers. The reactive person is a product of their environment. The observer becomes the master of their inner environment. And through this mastery, peace is no longer a temporary state. It becomes the natural resting place of your being.